You know, there was the terrible Abschied, the farewell, leaving everybody and everything behind you'd ever known, going to a scary world when you'd probably never been out of your village. The terrible ocean voyage. Unfortunately, this was before steam engines, so the sailing ships sailed when there was wind. There are stories of some very sad situations with people running out of food without the wind. The burials at sea, we know of some of them, and you have to put yourself in history to really, really understand it. You needed to be buried in your hallowed churchyard, and to be buried at sea was just gross. And there's a story of a woman that came to Texas who held her dead baby for days up against her breast so that people would think it was still alive so it wouldn't be buried at sea. They came to Galveston. Other than the seaport they left from, probably the only larger city they'd ever been in, and there were already charlatans trying to take any dime from them they could. But the heat, humidity, and mosquitoes never experienced by them. It's still bad on the beach after 175 years of insecticides and drainages, but it must have been one of the most horrible things that could have happened to them. They took a schooner. You'll hear people argue about whether they came to Galveston or Indian, or whether they came to boats, so quit arguing about it. This was a seaport, supposedly. It's kind of a spot on the beach that Prince Carl's idea was to isolate the Germans from those Texans and Americans. The first families did far better than the later families because there was still a little money for food, transportation, and such. By the way, Prince Carl did something very commendable. You know, most cultures in Europe did not celebrate this, but the Germans did. He put up the first Christmas tree that I know of in Texas in December of 1845, which was a bush, and I'm sure he had it done because, you know, he had a valet to dress him, so I'm sure he didn't decorate trees. But he remembered, and they did improvise. You know, in Vietnam, we had a metal tree with slit beer cans for decoration, so you can improvise. The later immigrants had just almost nothing. When the Mexican War broke out, the wagons all went to the war effort. Here we sat on the beach with our necessary things to survive, with no means of getting them hundreds of miles. A few poor young men even enlisted in a war they didn't know anything about, but they could get a paycheck. Hundreds died on the beach. There's not one sign of a single grave. It's very sad to you when you see that, when you know what's there, and there's no commemorative whatsoever there. One family bought a handcart, milk cow, tied bundles to it, and walked to Fredericksburg. Now, many people die there. For example, my grandchildren would be 8th generation, but they're only 7th because they lost 3 grandparents on the beach and 1 near Victoria, and they happen to have been the oldest generation. Now imagine here being a widow when your husband died. There's a Texas story of a man that flew overboard. Well, his wife was beside herself because it was her husband, her means of support on the frontier, and who carried all the money? Him. So I don't know which was worse. She landed with her children and nothing either except a few items. My mother used to say, oh, this is when you married the next guy that came down the road, because Valentine's came later. This was survival. My mother used to say, die arme alte Mutter. When she'd see an old woman that had lots of mileage from all of this, she'd say, the poor old woman, because they went through so much. You know, they had nothing to say to leave. They had nothing to say about anything. They didn't own anything. The husband even legally owned the children. So they just had to take what was there. Now finally, after 175 years, we're building a battered women's shelter there, here in town. So support that, please. The worst possible situation of all probably was the losing both parents. Imagine a child when it's desperate, who can take that child or those children? So they did have an orphanage in New Braunfels. Now many died on the trip from the beach to the New Braunfels and Fredericksburg. Unfortunately, Prince Carl, there's really nothing wrong with Prince Carl except he was an aristocrat. And if you remember from English literature, if you had to care about money, you weren't really that rich, like Rodeo Drive. So he didn't keep books or anything. He just kept charging and got seized by customs. I mean, the people in Galveston were not going to let him leave with all these bills. So when the poor Baron von Moisebach came here, very good replacement for Prince Carl. First thing he had to do was bring the money he had brought to bail him out with debts, and then more debts than New Braunfels. Now, why would a high-born, highly educated, with numerous college degrees, when most people didn't go to school or much, why would he come in this wilderness? Why would he leave a cultured family with a mansion and a library of 30,000 books? That always impresses me. Most people didn't have one at that time. The answer is freedom, like Gerald mentioned. He'd read about the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and about the people in Germany trying to get the aristocrats to allow freedom. He was such a firm believer in democracy, he even renounced his title. Now that's a big deal, Peggy, because you get you get many more dinner invitations as a countess than Mrs. somebody. So he gave up his station in life because he believed in this democracy. Remember, his last home was a little community on the way to Mason he named Loyal Valley, loyal to America. Second, but equally important, was his character. Upon arriving, he had used up those funds, I said. He had hundreds of settlers here and thousands coming with zero money. He couldn't share that with anybody. If he even told one of the officials, keep a secret, well, you know how that works. Then there'd be mass hysteria. So he had to take everything. Even when people wanted to attack him, individuals or groups, he had to keep that all to himself. Many of us would have quit. Then he did the amazing feat of doing that Comanche Peace Treaty, which literally saved many of the pioneers. The rangers said the safest place for them to travel in Texas was the German area because of that peace treaty. I'm proud that I had ancestors who signed the petition when they asked him to stay. When he was first thinking of quitting, they asked him to stay. Moisabah established this site between two creeks. The Pedernales area was already owned by land speculators, if you can believe that. We've been doing that ever since. And again, people were mad at New Braunfels and Fredericksburg because they were promised hundreds of acres and they were going to get a town lot and 10 acres outlot for farming. That's not the deal. Well, he couldn't do it at that time. Now, what we had here, our first houses were stockade houses. About a 14-foot square ditch with branches in it, wired together with vines and ropes, if they had any, with a grass roof. One Texas girl said her father wasn't a very good carpenter. He'd never built a house before, so they had to have umbrellas over their bed when it rained. The conditions were horrible. The first few years, we had 2 epidemics that killed over 100 people out of a few hundred, and then starvation. We can't even imagine how bad it was. The Durst brothers, for example, were interviewed when one of them was an old man by Mr. Penninger, who wrote the first 50 years. And he said twice they went to get food, to get corn. One time they went out to the rangers, and the rangers said they didn't have any that they could spare, but then miraculously, purposely or accidentally, one of the sacks tore, and they let them have the grain in that sack. And they walked back 16 miles with that corn. The other time, and I think it was Nicholas Zink who was building a mill here on the town creek, one of the 2 creeks, I forget which now. But he had brought a lot of corn and workers to build a mill for the workers and the horses. And when the Durst brothers got there, he said he couldn't spare any, and I'm sure he saw the sadness in their eyes. So he said, well, if you split all these logs for us to build a fence, you can have a bushel of corn. So they did that work for days and finally got that food. But the point of this story says it all. Thank God I found that old local almanac from early 1900s where Mr. Penninger wrote this. Mr. Durst, when he was an old man, said, thank God we came in the night, or we would have never have made it to the house with the corn. Does that statement tell you everything about the hunger? Okay, now, wrapping this up, in these 15 years, what we did experience, and we walk into probably the worst time, the Civil War. And you'd say, wow, worse than that? Yes, because now that some of the Indians rose up, not the treaty people, you know, we didn't make a treaty with every Indian in North America. Some of the renegade Indians came back because most of our men left to go up and kill each other during the Civil War. We were for the Union, but of course some people were conscripted into the military. So a lot of men left. And now we had to fear the Native Americans, our Anglo-Confederate neighbors that hated us dearly. You know how nuts people go in a crowd, or when they're politically or motivated for something. The Indian Americans, the Anglo-Confederate neighbors, but even some of our own people who were Confederates we didn't know about, who joined their cause and were spies in the community. How do you think they found out about the poor people going to Nueces that were massacred down there? Somebody told the officials. This group that did these terrible raids was called the Hanger Bandit, the Hanging Band. I'm always trying to remember to use the English too for some of you. They killed between 75 and 100 of our German men in these three counties, Kendall, Kerr, and Gillespie. There were no lines at that time, so that was this whole German area. Lily Rose told a story, you know, when the girls were pushed off the farm as extra baggage almost, they either had to find a job or marry because more than they needed for the household. Lily Rose worked in a business here on Main Street, and one day she was looking for something, and she went down in the basement to look for it and found where they were making ropes. Hanging band? She was so terrified, she did not ever tell anybody at home. She did not tell anybody until she told her daughter when she was in her 80s that that occurred. Out here on off the old Luckenbach Road, closer to Stonewall, not the one at KOA, there's a hanging tree that still exists. One of the men is still buried under it. Mr. Feller was moved to town, so we do know that tree was one of many that was used. And then the story gets worse for some of those people, because the widow Feller, who just lost her husband tragically and terribly, a man is standing there at the door saying, the man you bought your land from didn't own it. So Mrs. Feller, with children and a little bit of baggage to load in the wagon, lost her home and corn bin and crops and whatever, has to come to Fredericksburg during the middle of a war with children, with no money. So a Mr. Warman, I can't remember his first name right now, but he bought an IOU she had from her father. She didn't ever ask if he collected. She wouldn't have taken anything with pride, but she was hoping he had. But he gave her $100. Now, those days, she bought a house in Fredericksburg and supported her family for years. So some of you all got here a little late for the real estate. If you go up Austin Street towards the post office, where the street gets a little smaller, about 2 blocks before the post office, you will see our town and the beginning of our outlots. Across on Main Street, there's a house now on the beginning of the outlots for sale for over $700,000, a relatively small frame house. We should have bought that lot when we had a chance. So I'm here with you to revere these people for what they did for us. They really did everything for the foundation of our fine community, and it's a fine community. You might have seen last Sunday, Parade Magazine just named us one of the happiest 10 places in the United States to retire. So smile a lot this week when you see tourists, because we've got a reputation to uphold now. So remember, you people who are descendants, if there's just been one incident of one ancestor who ran into the wrong germ, caught pneumonia from a rain shower, died in childbirth, mother or child, one attacked by Native Americans or our Anglo neighbors, one who encountered a wild animal like the woman here that fought a wolf off, a pack of appendicitis, most diseases, illnesses just killed you. There wasn't much that could be done. And the dozens of other things that could have happened to your ancestors, you and I might be no-shows today. Thank you. And that's pretty good, since it's very hard to read my own writing.